the Ogaden War. Have you ever heard of a country named Ethiopia and Somalia? There are two countries in the Horn of Africa. They fought for a hopeless land filled with only violence and droughts. To the Somalis, it was their ancestors' homeland. To the Ethiopians, it was just a desert that made their country bigger in size. The land was called the Ogaden. The Ogaden was predominantly Somali, with a population of 5 million, mostly of whom were nomadic people. This land was once rightfully the Somalis, until the Scramble of Africa occurred, which is when European powers divided most of Africa. In the Horn of Africa, South Somalia belonged to the Italians, the North the British. Djibouti was later conquered by the French, also known as French Somaliland. To the west lied Ethiopia, the vast, unconquerable empire. The Italians had tried twice, but had failed. The Europeans there were so surprised and astonished on how brave they were, so they gave them the Ogaden as a prize, which was Somali territory. The end of World War II marked a significant time in which people started to feel a sense of nationalism. The Somalis sought their independence in 1960, 15 years after World War II. The North and South later unified under a democracy. Over the years, Somalia would be filled with prosperity, in which Somalia would be growing at a steady rate. Over the next few years, Ethiopia and Somalia would have a few border disputes that last through 1960 to 1963. They would finally come to an agreement in 1964. Over the years, Somalia would enjoy itself, but everything suddenly stopped in that moment in October 21, 1969. The military stepped in and committed a coup d'etat and killed President Abdurrashid Ali in the northern town of Las Alamo. A few hours later, a revolution took place, with a new government, with a new leader, and his name was Siad Barre. This day was called Black October. Over the next few years, the country began to adapt more into a communist country with the Marxist type of ideology that got its influences from the Quran and communism. The country later grew rapidly, and by 1976, they had the largest army in Africa after Egypt and South Africa. They got most of their supplies from the Soviet Union. While Somalia basked in the sunlight, the Ethiopian Empire was growing weaker. On September 12, 1974, a military junta led by the Coordinated Committee of Armed Forces overthrew the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie. In 1975, they started to embrace the ideology in communism, and they became allies with the Soviets. They elected President Haile Mengistu. In following years, the Ethiopian rulers ruled with fear. They ended up creating the Ethiopian Red Terror, which was when Ethiopia killed between 100,000 through 500,000 innocent people. Somalia later started to crack down on the violence against Muslims in Ethiopia. Their first action was to go to the UN. The Ethiopians didn't listen. The next step for the Somalis were to wage war against Ethiopia. The Somali National Army invaded Ethiopia at 300 July 13, 1977. The Somalis started the war with 70,000 troops and 300 tanks and 700 armored personal carriers. The whole Somali army started to mobilize and invade. By the end of July, almost 60% of the Ogaden was captured. At that time, the only thing Ethiopians had were major cities like Dardawa and Jigjiga, but that would all come to an end when Ethiopian defenders inflicted so many heavy casualties. Over the time, Ethiopia started to shift its air superiority into play, despite being outnumbered by Somali planes and technology hardware. That's when Cuban and South Yemen forces entered Ethiopia to support its people. When countries started to turn on Somalia like USSR, the Somali administration expelled all citizens from communist countries. like Russia, but they only maintained relationships with Vietnam, China, and Romania. The fall of Jigjiga. In mid-September, the Somalis launched a second full-scale attack on the major city of Jigjiga. This attack forever demoralized the Ethiopian defenders. By this time, the Ethiopians had no choice but to admit that they did not have no control over Ogaden. The Somalis lost more than 7,000 soldiers in that battle. For the Somalis, they were not able to get into native Ethiopian lands due to constant air raids and high terrain. During that time, the Ethiopian government raised an army of 100,000 soldiers to fight in the war. But in early 1978, the Somali army tried to invade Harar, but failed because 70,000 Cuban and Soviet troops were there defending the city. The Somalis at that time were too exhausted to fight three nations at once, so they retreated to the outskirts of the city and awaited a Cuban attack. But they also did not expect a second counterattack. By late February, the Ethiopians pushed the Somalis back to the Marta Pass, which was an extremely strategic point for the Somalis, and by that time, the Somalis knew they had no potential in fighting this war. The Somalis later recrossed the border, and the Ethiopians and Somalis later agreed on the ceasefire. Following the withdrawal of the Somali National Army forces, the rebels in the region continued their insurgency in Ethiopia. For the Somali government, it was a strategic blunder, and they broke all ties to communist states and moved towards the U.S. and democracy. 20 years later, Somalia went into a civil war. For the Ethiopians, they had went through a hard time, like the Ethiopian Red Terror, the Ethiopian Civil War, and the Eritrean War of Independence. Personal accounts of the Bede regime. Do you have any stories from October 21, 1969?
Yes, I remember a little bit. It was October 21, 1969 at 7 a.m. When I was in third grade, we were going to school, and between the school and our house was a big bank. When we passed the bank, there were a lot of soldiers laying on the floor ready to shoot, but they did not do anything. So we were scared and we walked slowly to school. By the time we were at the school, the principal told us that there was a revolution in place and military took power.
How was life under Siad Barre's rule?
The life under his rule was harsh. He did not give us a lot of freedom like speech and the right to vote. Life also was good like health care and education. He developed the country from just the livestock to a modern society.
How was the standard of living?
The standard of living, it was not
How did the war
bad.
affect your life?
The war affected my life in every way possible, like the loss of my brother and the start of a civil war that was caused by the conflict years earlier.
Did you like the war?
No. Even though the war was fought for a good reason, they shouldn't have started conflict and should have just been diplomatic.